We're doomed. We're doomed.
No big fire traitor.
Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 3rd of June 2024. I am joined as ever by my magnificent co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman, and today, one day after the primary events commemorating the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings, we are happy to report that we are not having to disappear midway through our recording for a prior engagement. Just as people who study history, and also as you obviously are as a conflict archaeologist, what our Prime Minister did yesterday was quite astonishing, wasn't it?
It is absolutely unbelievable. For people who aren't following this, the D-Day landings is one of the iconic events of the 20th century. The return of what was then being called the United Nations to France, to occupied France, to try and remove Nazi Germany from Europe, basically, with all that goes with that. The 80th anniversary is probably the last significant anniversary where there will be any living participants in the D-Day landings, being there for the commemoration. There were, when in previous commemorations, there's been hundreds and then tens. Yesterday, the British contingent, I think, was just over 20.
Yes.
And the youngest was 97.
Yeah.
So we're on the edge of a major internationally important historical cultural event going out of living memory, with all the questions that raises about future remembrance and historical understanding and so on.
Actually, on that note, a former US serviceman, Robert Persuade, died en route from Rochester, New York, to commemorate the 80th anniversary. He was aged 102 and was airlifted. He was getting a boat across the Atlantic, presumably because flying was too difficult for a man of his age, and airlifted to a hospital in Germany where he died. So these people are incredibly fragile, and as you say, there's going to be a whole passing, hopefully, of that torch to people who never experienced these events. So this was crucial. The 80th anniversary was absolutely crucial. Yeah.
That's right. And what happened was there was a British commemoration in the morning, which Rishi Sunak and other British political leaders attended. And then in the afternoon, there was an American commemoration, which was the guest of honor was President Biden. And then later in the afternoon, there was an international event. President Macron of France attended both, of course. And then all the political leaders came together on what had been Omaha Beach on D-Day to have an event of commemoration and remembrance. And it was striking that I was watching it yesterday afternoon, and you saw President Biden, you saw President Macron as the host. And you saw we're now 80 years on, and we're allies, not adversaries. Chancellor Scholz of Germany was there too. But all three of them heads of state or heads of government. Britain, however, was represented by Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, and that was decidedly, oh no, wait a minute, where's Sunak? Because Sunak was there earlier. This is a heads of state level event. So where's he gone? It transpired later in the evening that he'd flown back to Britain after the British event had ended, because his office had booked an interview with Paul Brand of ITN News, which isn't even due to go out until next Wednesday, a week after the D-Day event. So effectively, they prioritized a piece of political electioneering over participation at head of state level in a major international commemorative event, which has all sorts of resonances for the world we live in today, of course, with because another guest of honor was President Zelensky of Ukraine.
Hmm.
And to cap the incompetence, really, of what Sunak and Sunak's office allowed to happen, one of the main press images of the day was the current opposition leader, Keir Starmer, meeting President Zelensky, as though head of state to head of state. In fact, there's all the memes are doing the rounds along the lines of Zelensky saying, "Oh, well, I'll pop into Downing Street and see you in a month's time then." Because Starmer was being allowed to look like the head of state.
Yeah,
it's astonishing.
And it's astonishing on various levels. First of all, on the level of just basic human decency and respect. But
yes,
it's astonishing that he did.
Important thing.
Yeah. But it's astonishing, even if he is in electioneering mode, that he didn't take this as an opportunity to have a day off from being hounded by the press and say, "Come on, guys, let's take a moment to respect the achievements of that generation and the solemn echo for the world today." He could have used it to look more statesmanly, but instead he scurries back home for an interview with a journalist. That's just. It's.
It's better than that, though, Mark, because the interview obviously ITN put the interview in the can yesterday because that's the day they've been booked for.
Yeah,
there's no reason to. That's what they say. They weren't offered an alternative date, and I think we can take them at their word. But what they did do was what's called clip up a part of the interview. So they release an extract to build anticipation, but also to reinforce the news story of the day. And the clip they released was Prime Minister Sunak denying that he'd lied about a claim that Labour would charge every family in the country £2,500 extra in tax, which had already been blown up as inaccurate and not to be used because it was a political construct by the Chief Secretary of the Treasury. And yesterday, at tea time yesterday, around 6 o'clock, a press release from the government statistics watchdog, which makes sure that politicians use statistics effectively and fairly. So he was drawing, what they got was a really bad look in terms of hightailing it back to Britain, bailing on this major international event in order to take part in an interview. And the key bit of the interview, which was let go by the broadcaster, was Sunak drawing more attention to the fact that independent people are saying that he'd lied to the public in the prime ministerial debate on Tuesday evening. I mean, if people aren't familiar with it, there's a wonderful British political satire called The Thick of It, which is about how government comms works, and basically the levels of venality and incompetence of the people in the series who make it work. He's famous for having a character who allegedly is loosely based on Tony Blair's director of comms, Alistair Campbell, called Malcolm Tucker, who is he's one of the sweariest characters that's ever been put on TV. In fact, there's a I think one of the series has a swearing consultant listed in the credits. Incredibly creative use of language. But if Armando Iannucci, who created The Thick of It, and also obviously created things like The Death of Stalin and so on, if Armando Iannucci had written this as an episode of The Thick of It, they probably would have dumped it as not credible.
Yeah.
I mean, it is just astonishing.
Yeah.
Just
astonishing. So disrespectful, lazy, egotistical, and seemingly defending a proven lie. It's just
absolutely.
Anyway,
if they weren't already, after this, there'll be Conservative candidates all over the country who will be in absolute despair that they're trying to save their party and their careers, and at the top, this is going on. It's, as I say, you couldn't make it up. Go back to conflict archaeology and military history and so on. It's largely discredited now, actually, but there's a phrase that's talked about a lot in reference to the First World War, which is lions led by donkeys. But if there was ever an example of that being the case in politics, I think this Conservative general election campaign fits that description. It's been one pratfall after another, most of them unforced errors. And it's got to the stage now where people are even saying, wait a minute, has Sunak got a spread bet on the size of the Conservative defeat?
Yes. Well, never mind lions led by donkeys, liars led by donkeys. Of course, as relatively impartial journalistic types, we can't assert that that's definitely the case for everyone, but certainly based on Sunak's behaviour in recent days.
I mean, I think the point, as we must, dragging it back to the history and archaeology and the heritage world that we're a part of, and we talk about in these podcasts. It's one of those occasions when what we do in terms of finding out about history, putting that history in front of the public, comes to the widest possible public on events like the D-Day commemoration. In the same way they do at big events like coronations and things like that. The historical context suddenly becomes really, really important. And I know, as somebody who's worked in the field for over 20 years now, I know that the sensitivities and feelings of veterans, of families, of people who have lived experience of World War II and passed on that lived experience to their families and so on. It's really important to many, many people. And people, it's one of those occasions when people say, "Oh, well, what's the point in studying history? It's all in the past." History is just one effing thing after another, as Alan Bennett said in History Boys. It's actually a core part of other people's lives, and I think people who sit in offices in Downing Street may be playing sort of four-dimensional chess in political strategies, should get out in the real world a little bit more and talk to people to whom this stuff actually matters, and what happened yesterday will be hurtful. And also I think we'll see, we can talk about what if we don't mark events like that and mark them thoughtfully and respectfully, and openly, and engage wider communities. It's what we'll miss. And in a sense, that's what we're going to be talking about in the main topic of today's watching brief, because of the On the Brink report from the Heritage Alliance, which talks about the heritage world of which those commemorations are actually a part, and what state they're in, and what we would lose if things go badly. And that's badly on account of often decisions by politicians.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I mean, you say for other people, it's important. I think that's the point. For seemingly, if a leader is behaving like that, and if government and decision makers are behaving like that, history and its importance is for other people, not least because you cannot make, as far as they're concerned, you cannot make an easy profit from it. Although, of course, this report that we're going to be looking at today highlights that that's not necessarily the case, counterintuitive as that may sound to some. But yes, we're into the main part of this week's episode by looking at the Heritage Alliance's report titled On the Brink. I've certainly pointed this out in other places. We've talked about it and pointed to it in a previous watching brief, because it's a very important report, very timely report, and as you've said to a mutual friend of ours, a mutual friend and colleague, we're doomed, apparently. Although you didn't use the word doomed. Now,
I did go full Malcolm Tucker, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, you did. And the key findings when we initially open up the report are that dramatic. We have 5 top bullet points, as it were. First of all, that heritage is facing an existential threat. If it's not looked after, it declines rapidly, they say. Secondly, heritage has particular vulnerabilities. Whilst all sectors have felt the brunt of economic pressures in recent years, pre-existing challenges have made the heritage sector particularly vulnerable, they say. Thirdly, heritage is, in fact, a resilient and resourceful sector. I would agree with that. Many of my friends and colleagues are very clever, resourceful, and have to do a lot with very little. They say here, heritage organisations have survived and thrived in the face of significant threats, many of them in recent history. This is true. Fourth of five, they say, heritage is part of the solution. Our sector is uniquely placed to drive sustainable growth and offer support to those that need it most, they say. And finally, in this report, heritage could do more with more. Investment in our sector will yield benefits for everyone. The transformative Culture Recovery Fund was unprecedented, but does not need to be unrepeatable. Sustained, sustainable and targeted investment is needed at this critical time to stimulate growth and unleash the social good that heritage has the power to provide. It's a very well-written report, isn't it? Because as grim as that first point about heritage being in this position of facing an existential threat, and as the report is titled, being on the brink, they do also turn it around to focus on ways in which actually heritage, if just given a little bit of nourishment, will come back and will grow and will actually help the economy to grow as well. But where do you want to start with talking about this report?
I want to start by putting the report in context.
Yes.
For people who aren't familiar with it, where it came from, who created it, and what with. Because I think the report itself and its timing is really interesting, and I'll come to that in a minute. Basically, the Heritage Alliance was created in 2002, so it's just over 20 years old. It's an umbrella body for heritage bodies in the UK, large and small, up to and including organisations like Historic England and English Heritage and the National Trust. Yeah, but also smaller operations like individual museums, historic buildings, that kind of thing. So it has a wide membership, and it's there to lobby and campaign and provide evidence to political decision makers at a local and national level about heritage, which is where this report comes in. Now, obviously, we can talk later maybe about how effective archaeology as part of the heritage sector is has the ability to campaign and lobby.
Well, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I was going to say, so we are allowed to campaign. Interesting.
The thing is that we can talk about that later, maybe, and perhaps we should. But effectively, yes, many of these organisations are charities, and the Charities Commission has said explicitly that if it's part of your core charitable aims, yes, you can campaign. So yes, you can campaign for more funding for your sector if you're a heritage body. Yes, you can ask the government to change the law to provide more protection for the historic environment if you're a heritage body, and that's one of your core aims is promoting and preserving the heritage environment. So this idea that we're a charity, we can't campaign, is to use the technical term bullshit. But
you're all about the colourful words around this report, definitely.
Well, this report was, I think, clearly commissioned with an approaching general election in mind. Now, I'll explain why. I don't think the Heritage Alliance knew that there was going to be an election called at the end of May.
No.
In fact, apparently even Rishi Sunak's cabinet didn't know that there was going to be an election called at the end of May. He'd asked the King for a dissolution of Parliament before he actually told his cabinet members.
Wow. Okay. He's just a comms magician, isn't he? He just knows how to inform people of things and how to look good.
We've already been down that rabbit hole once on this podcast. I think we probably ought to avoid it. But now, look, I don't think the Heritage Alliance knew that the general election was going to be called as early as it was. There was always the risk it might be, but I suspect that originally their timing for releasing this, just almost days actually before Sunak called the election, was to put it in the public domain. And with an autumn-winter general election in mind, because what it is a manifesto for that the Heritage Alliance wants to put down in front of the new government on July the 5th, whoever forms it.
Yes.
And it is also, I think, significant that it was the primary authors. If you look at the section at the end, which describes the report and how it came about and who contributed to it and so on, the principal authors are Kathleen Keown and another person called Momina Matin. Now, both of those are civil servants who were on secondment to the Heritage Alliance. That happens a lot in government, where civil servants at various stages in their careers get seconded to companies, organisations, and so on, in order, for them to share how government works with those bodies, but also for them to learn how those bodies, how those industries, those businesses, those sectors work, so they can feed that back into government. And the idea is it makes government more effective.
Okay.
And I think it's really significant that the report was written by effectively two civil servants, because it's written in a way, it's densely written, it's evidenced, it's building a case, it's a briefing to be put before a minister. And the bullet points and the case studies are, briefing notes to engage the minister's interest if he's not going to read the whole, the whole report, which is, I think, 70 odd pages altogether. So that's significant. It is also funded by Historic England, and which is obviously the government regulator for the heritage sector in England and Wales. In England, and it draws on data from Historic England built up over the last 3 or 4 years from the COVID during and after the COVID pandemic. And there's also involvement from English Heritage and a commercial company called Ecclesiastical Insurance, which handles insurance for a lot of heritage buildings, and which is one of the issues that's discussed in the report. And it came about as a result of a call for comments and experiences from Heritage Alliance members. And that covers, as we said earlier, that covers a very wide spectrum of people in the heritage environment, working in the heritage environment. So, it's a broadly based report based on data and written by people who are trained to present data to government ministers. And I think we have to see it in that. We have to see it in those terms. And finally, down to the presentation. Obviously, we've only seen the PDF, but it is strikingly well presented. And the reason I made the joke about Private Fraser in Dad's Army and his, we're doomed catchphrase is, broadly speaking, that's what the report is saying. It's saying we're doomed if.
Yes. And
the if is if these certain things aren't done. So, but in fact, instead of Private Fraser on the cover, we have and the credit is given to English Heritage, but a very moody, brooding, stormy image of Tintagel Castle, the rock on which Tintagel Castle stands, which really sets this sort of sense of Gothic menace as you open the report. So it's a, if nothing else, even if you disagree with every single conclusion, I think it's a classy piece of work.
It is. It's extremely well put together. I think actually a lot of academic colleagues could learn a thing or two about presentation from this sort of document when they're putting together their posters and presentations at conferences. Yes. But it's interesting, as you say, that it's written by effectively civil servants, because the chapter headings don't read like chapter headings that an archaeologist or an architectural historian or someone running the National Trust might have come up with. It reads as someone who has an interest in, broadly speaking, financial sustainability, has come up with these chapter headings. And it's the body of the chapters that actually describe how these headings relate to practice and the importance of that practice. But the fact that you have, for example, chapter 1, energy bills, chapter 2, staffing, chapter 3, public engagement. Now that's probably the most
Jargon.
jargon, or the most sort of human-facing aspect of these chapters. Chapter 4, cutting costs. That is to say, the fact that everyone is having to cut costs at the moment. And finally, Chapter 5, funding, where funding is coming from and how funding is doing. It lays out problems, but also those areas where solution-orientated practice should be focusing. What stands out to you? Because I mean, obviously, the thing is, a lot of this is already obvious to many people within these various sectors, of which archaeology is only a part of this heritage umbrella. And things like the cost of living, things like budgets for projects, balancing public engagement and, for example, having volunteers on site versus getting an excavation done or having a project have a certain outcome. These are all things that have been headaches for archaeologists for the past 14, 15, 20 years. What do you make of this as a document put together now? Is it just like, no shit, Sherlock, or is it actually a case of this is important for right now, and actually archaeologists should be supporting the dissemination of this report?
The latter.
Right.
This isn't written for archaeologists. We know this stuff. We might not know it in quite so much brutal economic detail, but we've all been involved in projects which, for example, have under the from Heritage Lottery, for example, where you have a 3-year or 5-year program and then it's not funded after that, and the report talks about short-termism in funding.
Yeah.
I give you a case in point. I remember in the late noughties, I was doing things with the Thames Discovery Programme, which was in London. It was a pioneering community archaeology programme to look at the foreshore of the River Thames, right the way through from West London through to the tidal section down where I am here at Greenwich and Woolwich. It was a brilliant program. It was thoroughly, it was hugely successful in engaging a volunteer recording force, the frogs. But I remember talking to the colleagues who were actually running the program at the time, and the last 6 months of the program was roughly spent trying to work out what can we save, what can we continue with when the funding runs out, because this is proven so effective. Which was a complete waste of time. They shouldn't have been in a position of doing that. If the program, the program had proven itself, it should have been in a position to make itself sustainable, and the funding should have been available to make it sustainable without that kind of effort. So it's things like that that we might know about individually at an anecdotal level, which need to be put in front of the politicians who make these decisions. Most fundamentally, though, it's saying, look, heritage, the public cares, it attracts volunteers, it can attract philanthropy. It is hugely important in terms of community cohesion, identity, placemaking. And it returns massively on the currently very small investment that the heritage sector gets from government. Now,
well, I think it even lays out here that it's a safer and more readily profitable investment than even the defence budget, for example, or spending on military systems. It's a much more direct benefit to people and the economy, which is sounds kind of counterintuitive, considering how much we do spend in Britain, certainly, for example, in the US, on things like defence and the military industrial complex. That's interesting to see written down, and again written down by people who've been put on secondment effectively from the government support machine. That's fascinating. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, yeah. For people aren't familiar with the way the British civil service works, it's not like countries like the States, for example, where a lot of the civil servants are political appointments, senior managers of political appointments, and so on. The British civil service operates independently of government, whoever forms the government, and is there to enact what the government wants to do objectively, within the law.
Well, for example, here in Chapter 5 on funding, there's a nice little highlighted box that says, ultimately, the collapse of local authority cultural funding is not just a crisis for individual organisations, but for our national cultural heritage. They actually put that in bold. It reflects a broader failure to recognise the vital role that culture and heritage can and do play in supporting community well-being and levelling up national economic growth. They're even using party political jargon there. Levelling up is a darling of the Johnsonian and Sunak government. So again, yes. It's written to convince, isn't it? To persuade.
Yes. Yeah, it is. It's a manifesto. But it's an evidenced manifesto. It's not just promises. It's saying, look, if you invest this, we can deliver that. And that that will make you look good. It'll sustain the sector, and it'll make you look good.
Yeah.
Now, but obviously, the problem with this and being realistic about it, yes, every archaeologist watching this should download this report and share it with their friends and networks, and get them to share it with their local councillor, their local MP. It's probably one of the most powerful documents that the heritage sector has produced in a long time. And as I say, it was clearly produced with that in mind.
Yes.
But I think we also, it talks about things. And now we've talked on Watching Brief before about many of the issues that are highlighted in the report, many of the personnel issues that are highlighted in the report. Just two things, just on personnel. First of all, it accepts quite rightly that people are at the centre of all of this. Paid professionals and volunteers and members of the community. And a lot of the report is about bringing those together in various ways. But it highlights issues, for example, volunteer dependency. Now, we're recording this during Volunteer Week in Britain, when we rightly celebrate the people who volunteer in our communities. You've done it, I've done it at various times. Many people do volunteer in various ways. But as I always say, and I say this partly from experience as a volunteer on the board of directors of a grade 2 listed building, which is heavily reliant on volunteers to operate. And that is, and in fact, finally, when we finish recording, I'm off to the local council's volunteer awards, where it says thank you to the volunteers in the borough every year.
Yes.
But
and
volunteering, that might be a part of it.
Yeah.
Look,
hey, take what you can. Nice sandwich.
Absolutely, yeah. Yes, yeah. What politicians call the rubber chicken circuit.
Yeah.
Look, volunteering is at the core of a lot of what happens in the heritage world. But volunteering can only be done effectively and safely if there are the paid professionals to facilitate it. It's and this is the kind of thing it talks about.
Well, and in that context, with volunteer dependency, just prior to that, they mentioned historically low wages.
They absolutely talk about historically low wages, and workforce retention. Exactly the kind of things that CIFA members seem to want CIFA to campaign on, which CIFA is declining to campaign on.
Yeah. So really, I asked you yesterday about pandas, didn't I? When we were doing a little bit of agenda prep for today's episode, pandas, turkeys, however you want to frame them, are unfortunately some parts of the archaeological part of this umbrella of heritage a little bit too likely to either be the turkey that votes for Christmas or the panda that refuses to meet up with a partner and make the next generation of pandas. In that sense, far too happy eating a piece of bamboo and just grateful that the bamboo's there, as opposed to actually thinking about the future and engaging with people who, if we leave the panda to one side for a second, people who are desperate for them to consider things like pay conditions, the quality of the sector. And I say that in both in terms of its output, but also in terms of what it's like to be an archaeologist or a museum specialist or a public-facing heritage worker, the quality of what that's like to experience, both as the public, but also as the person doing it, living it, and then having to go home and make sure the bills are paid. Is this? I mean, you were saying that we should, friends and colleagues should be sharing this with potentially local people of a political persuasion, MPs, particularly on their campaigning route. But should this be a moment for bodies like CIFA to actually sit up and pay attention? Because it feels as though they haven't. And the reason why I say this is that we've seen very little on their social media about the fact that there's a general election at all. Never mind the fact that this is an opportunity, and that's what this is. It's laying out not only the risks, but also the opportunity to be in on the ground floor with a new administration, whether it's red, white, blue, or whatever, whichever party it is, in addressing these key existential issues. Do you think that's actually happening? Are people paying attention?
I think we can see what tends to happen. I think in the archaeology world, and please, leadership of CIFA, CBA, FAME, please tell me I'm wrong. Tell our sector that I'm wrong. But what I think happens, and I would cite the so-called Attack on Nature campaign that was led by the National Trust and the RSPB when the Liz Truss government tried to effectively remove the environmental checks and balances from planning. Those organisations, which are part of the Heritage Alliance, ran a very effective lobbying campaign against that policy initiative, and
scared the bejesus out of a lot of backbench
as I say, scared the bejesus out of a lot of backbench MPs. And it's interesting that when Sunak came into power, when the lettuce finally wilted, and Liz Truss was kicked out and was forced to resign, Sunak didn't return to that initiative, although he's a right-wing political economy. He believes in a sort of free market economy, much less regulated than it currently is, I think. But he didn't have the political capital to return to that one.
No.
And but during that campaign, main archaeological bodies were pretty much silent, although CBA is a member of the Heritage Alliance. And I think there's the argument, there's a suggestion maybe that because, and you can understand why this might happen, these are relatively small organisations. They don't have big back offices. They don't have big advertising budgets. They piggyback on the back of much better resourced organisations like the National Trust, like the RSPB, when it comes to campaigns like this. It also means as well they don't get any flack. If you look at,
but it also means they're never going to get any funding and they're never going to get any attention. The less you do, the less people want to give you. This is the reason why, infamously, councils spend up all of their roadworks budget at one time of the year, so they don't miss out on money in the next budget. You've got to be proactive, surely.
Yeah, but then we know from the pay and conditions row that's engulfed CIFA and FAME with pressure groups like the Badger Facebook group and so on, pushing for the particularly CIFA to be more proactive.
Yeah.
in campaigning for better paying conditions for its members. But you see, the thing is, even if you don't want to get your hands grubby campaigning for something, money just to keep the sector going,
Yeah.
there are a couple of points in the chapter in the report on staffing. It talks about a number of things which really ought to be front and center of archaeological organizations campaigning for better resourcing and better training. And that it talks about across the sector, but this is particularly applicable in archaeology, I think. We're coming to the end of the active generation who grew up in rescue archaeology in the 1970s and early 80s and the beginnings of PPG 16 and developer-funded archaeology. With all that experience of local areas, all that experience of particular digging particular kinds of site and so on. An aging workforce. The report addresses the issues of aging workforce and replacing both aging professionals, but also aging volunteers. You look at the age demographic of volunteer stewards and a National Trust property. Certainly, traditionally, it's people who have retired. Now, okay, people can retire even in their 40s, certainly in their 50s now, with many years, thankfully, of active life ahead of them. But
sorry, go on.
At some point, that they are going to need to be replaced, and new ideas, new possibilities need to be introduced. The other thing that the report mentions in the same chapter is specialist skills, be that specialist conservation skills in terms of handling particular materials, working with particular materials in terms of historic buildings and so on, or in archaeology particular, things like find specialists. You could probably name. Okay, it's probably unfair on the other professional find specialists who are out there doing the work, but asked to name a specialist in early medieval pottery, and people will think of Paul Blinkhorn.
Yes, yeah.
One person.
Yeah, one person who I've directly talked about, and I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying this now. It's been a few years since we had this private conversation. About legacy, about whether or not he'd be willing to create a PDF document of some of his accrued knowledge for other aspiring pottery specialists. And he's a lovely man. He believes in accessible knowledge. He believes in the people and the people's history, in that sense, having access to that knowledge. But two things have prevented him from doing this, and probably will prevent him from ever doing it. First of all, he hasn't got the time, because there are so few pottery specialists. He's always got people coming to him and asking him to go through their collections or their post-ex work. Secondly, though, because there's so few pottery specialists, he gets all the work, and therefore he's disincentivized from making it easier for other people to do that work, because of the model, meaning that there is a race to the bottom. There's ever more competition on ever less in the way of funding and in the way of time to get work done. So he's stuck. He can't, and it becomes a sort of a cycle of decline. Now, on that note, actually, there's another part of the report that I'd just like to quote, if that's okay. Do you mind?
No, of course.
Yeah. So archaeological stewardship and active participation are at the heart of what we should do in education and research, with young people, in community archaeology, and in all our advocacy work, whether that is safeguarding historic buildings, reforming the Treasure Act, campaigning to protect rural heritage, or deriving maximum public value from development-led archaeology. The entire archaeological sector needs to work together with new and innovative collaborations, creating stronger future partnerships to support even greater public involvement and action. The archaeological discipline of the future is a strong, appropriately rewarded and highly skilled profession that works closely with an active community and voluntary sector. Now, there's a problem with that quote. Do you know what it is?
You tell me.
It's from January 2011. 2011, in issue 250 of Current Archaeology. It's 13 years old, and we've done absolutely sweet FA.
Yes.
I'm personally very frustrated by this. I've always been frustrated by this. It's been a feature of my career. That basically was published just before I started Archaeosoup, and a few years after I graduated into an economic crash. It was published in the context of swinging, as they say, swinging budget cuts to the sector. And what they were trying to say on the cover of that magazine was, after the cuts, are we facing a new dawn? Will there be new shoots of growth? Is there new potential and possibility for archaeology? I would submit that this latest report from the Heritage Alliance really shows that people were asleep at the wheel, unfortunately. Yes. And I'm irritated by that, and I want to see better. And as much as stepping back from a sort of a commentary role here, more to a personal statement, I'm particularly irritated by the fact that whenever, especially you're well known seemingly for being someone who goes yes, and you're sort of like the improv of public archaeology, and problems with funding and problems with interaction with the public and so on and so forth. Yes, and okay, that's great, but can we do better? Recently, we've seen more and more of a siloing issue within certain social media circles of archaeologists who put themselves forward as being leaders within our sector, essentially saying we should never rock the boat. We shouldn't look for controversy, when actually what we're doing is highlighting the fact that things haven't changed in 13 years. And we certainly shouldn't bring archaeologists into discussions about, say, planning and budgeting and the importance of work and the way that work relates to the community. Again, this is a personal comment. What the hell should we be doing then with this work? Are we, and I've mentioned this in a recent interview I did actually with Howard Williams. I'm not plugging the interview. I'm just saying, I mentioned this in
go on, plug it.
No. Well, I mean, yeah, feel free to go and check it out.
Any conversation with Howard's worth listening to.
It is, yeah, it's grand. But feel free to check it out. But in that, I sort of came to a very similar moment where I found myself basically wondering, what is it that archaeologists want from their career? And it seems an awful lot of people just want to be left alone to do their own little bits of research and be the specialist in that research. I'm not talking about Paul Blinkhorn here, just because we mentioned him before, and basically not to be bothered by having to think about things like politics, like funding, like interacting with the public, like going to Whitehall, actually having meetings with people and doing something substantial to have this so-called new dawn back in 2011. It doesn't happen, and it hasn't happened. And as much as we're not about to see people voting for archaeological leadership, we are about to see the country probably turning the page on that chapter that started in 2010, 2011, and has strangled our heritage sector almost to the point of unconsciousness.
Shall I give a quick bit of context to what you've just said? When the coalition government came in under the leadership of the Conservatives, David Cameron, in May 2010, they embarked deliberately on a program of what they called austerity, and they claimed it was a response to the famous note that was left by the outgoing Labour Chief Secretary of the Treasury, I think it was, Liam Byrne, who said that there's no money left. Which is a traditional joke that Treasury ministers do for their successors. And the upshot of that was, over the next few years, heritage bodies, directly and indirectly, whether it was Historic England, that was then English Heritage, or museums, local authorities, cultural funding, even our own CBA, lost something like a third of their funding, almost overnight. Yeah, with all that entailed.
And then it kept on shrinking as well. It wasn't a one.
And then it's kept on shrinking and is likely to shrink in future. And again, that's the context of this report. And I think it's also very clear that whoever forms a government on July the 5th, they're going to have to make some very difficult choices about whether they raise taxes or whether they cut public services, public funding for public services, including funding to local authorities, including cultural funding, of which heritage is a part.
Yeah.
And and the report is very strong on spelling out what the consequences of that are. Just this week, okay, this is Scotland rather than England, but there was another museum that was proposing selling off a valuable marble sculpture, something worth estimates £2 or £3 million at least. And the excuse being given was that it couldn't display it because of insurance issues. That's covered in the report.
Yeah.
But that's the same excuse that Northampton Borough Council used to sell the statue of Sir Kemker. They claimed that they couldn't display it because it was too valuable and they couldn't get the insurance for it.
Yeah.
Again, to use the technical term, it turned out to be bullshit. But it's a powerful argument in the current funding climate. And all over the country, there will be public collections, publicly held collections, collections held in trust for the public by a local authority in museums and galleries, where valuable items could be cherry picked for sale. For a short-term sugar rush of an extra, couple of million, few £100,000. And the thing is, it's like the investment in people. Once the people are gone, once the experience is gone, once the people who can train the new people are gone, it's all gone. And that's why the report is called On the Brink.
Yeah.
Now, I think the other thing about you talked about the sector. I think another significant, when you're trained to look at the subtext of documents, you ask questions about why this, why that. The content page is faced by a series of comments about the content of the report and about the place of heritage.
Yep.
And I think it's very instructive looking at the names on that list
and what they do.
And what they do.
Yeah.
The smallest organisation on there is the Canal and Rivers Trust. Richard Perry, their chief executive, is quoted. You've then got the Association of Independent Museums quoted.
Yep.
The CEO of the Architectural Heritage Fund, which is a conservation charity looking at historic buildings,
which is painfully close to archaeology.
Painfully close.
Yeah.
We're getting closer to archaeology.
Yeah.
We've got the Ben Cowell, the director of historic houses, again a charity looking at the challenges facing historic houses. And then we get to the big guns. We've got Dr. Nick Merriman, the recently appointed chief executive of English Heritage, who used to be the chief executive of the Horniman Museum, which has been Museum of the Year. But also, I think earlier on in his career, he was with MOLA, Museum of London Archaeology.
Yeah.
And very active as an archaeologist in London. Latterly gone into museums. So he's now, that's the English Heritage having been hived off, the historic buildings collection having been hived off by the government to get the cost off the books. It's meant to be able to raise money and operate independently. I think COVID has damaged that ambition, but the English Heritage is in a really interesting position at the moment in terms of trying to move forward, and it's done work with things. And again, as the report highlights, access work with things like the organisations like the Trussell Trust to give access to heritage to people who, for example, are using food banks. But that has to be paid for, as the report makes the point. If you're giving somebody free access, that access still has to be paid for.
Yep.
And then finally, the biggest gun of all is Hilary McGrady, the Director General of the National Trust.
Yeah.
There is nobody quoted from a specifically archaeological body.
No, no. And what I would say is that director of the Association of Independent Museums and chief executive of the Canal and River Trust are, they're not to be ignored because they're here. But I would say that the chief executive of the Council for British Archaeology, for example, could have been there on a similar level.
You might say that. I couldn't possibly comment.
Yeah. Now, what we're going to be doing, folks, in the next couple of weeks, because obviously we don't just want to be talking about depressing things or things that are meant to rile you up. We're going to be sprinkling a little bit of sugar in with some of the analysis.
So, sorry, can I just interrupt there, Mark?
Yep.
This isn't depressing stuff. This is really important stuff. This is important. This is about possibilities. What the report is really strong on is what we can be if we're properly supported, properly funded. It's a wish list. They're not going to get anywhere near those wishes granted. But it's putting that wish list out there. And if people pick it up and run with it, there's a chance that at least some of those things might happen. And boy, do they need to happen.
I'm saying depressing in the context of the same issues being talked about in 2011. Yeah. But anyway, yes, we will be returning first of all to actually our coverage of the past 14 years, more or less, in terms of archaeological news stories. We think it's going to be an interesting exercise to go through our Watching Brief playlist and just highlight why it is right now we are talking about why it is archaeologists and archaeological bodies should be talking to the incoming government and their local politicians. This isn't a fringe of archaeology being interested in politics. It's literally how we get to do archaeology, and I think looking at those stories will highlight
whether we even can.
Well, whether we even can, and also as well, it will highlight, I think, a couple of missed opportunities. Off the top of my head, I can remember a few that we've covered. So it'd be interesting to take a look at that. We are quite possibly going to be getting someone to talk about green archaeology, not necessarily from a specific Green Party point of view, although I think the person we have in mind is affiliated with the Green Party in some respects. But I won't tie that down too much here. We'll have to wait and see if they're available. And the other thing that we have planned is we're going to be talking about as a little treat. Media, and this comes out of a conversation that started yesterday and went on for far longer than we had planned, because we were meant to be recording yesterday, about the D-Day commemorations and the presence of Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, and how movies communicate and are in fact used in many respects by the public as a shorthand for what happened in the past, and how archaeologists in recent years have related to movie making and films. I do not want to relitigate that conversation now, so I'm not going to say anything else more specific than that, because we literally spoke for about 2 hours when we were meant to be. I was meant to be going out the door. I'm just popping out the door. I just wanted to mention something to you, Andy, and then we just didn't stop talking.
Can I point out as well that we appeared to finish the conversation, and then within seconds almost you rang me back.
I did
because there was something else you wanted to talk
yes
about.
I did. I'm as bad as you were, but yes, this time we'll record it, so at least you'll have some entertainment when at times one of us becomes maybe a touch exasperated. I don't know, we'll see. And of course we still want to do questionable archaeology as well. We're planning on bringing together some questions that have already been sent our way for that. You may recall that was something that we were planning for the beginning of the year, but life and events got in the way. So we'll be doing that in the build-up to this general election in the UK. And we would like to invite you to submit any questions you have for that. Questions about what we've been talking about today, questions about this report, of course, is linked in the video description below. If actually, I was going to say, if you're interested, what I will do is actually make a little PDF of what I've just quoted from 2011 as well. I'll put a link to that below so you can compare and contrast some of the issues, if there is much in the way of contrast. And anything else as well. I mean, you were inviting people to let us know if this comes up on the doorstep, perhaps if a local party activist or even an MP comes to your door. And
a prospective parliamentary candidate. They're not
exactly.
MPs at the moment.
Yes, yeah.
Yep.
and mentioned
Of whatever
heritage.
party.
Yeah, whatever party. Mentioned heritage, history, cultural funding, museums, art galleries, so on and so forth. Then let us know what they've said, because we're about to see the publication of the not prospectuses, the manifestos. Yes, aren't we? And
We
that should
are
give us something to
the
look
party.
at.
That's right. The party manifestos, their promise list. They are due to be published probably starting next week. And we'll be doing a digest of all of the party manifestos that we can track down, where they have information about promises about heritage and culture that are relevant to the heritage sector and to archaeologists. We'll put all that information in one place, and we'll talk about it on the watching brief. Whatever you thought about it, for example, the Labour manifesto in 2019 was quite strong actually on cultural issues. Things can come up in manifestos, which you can then hold the politicians to if they're elected. So we'll be doing that too. The idea is we're certainly not at this stage suggesting you vote for anyone in particular. What we want to do is, as we said in our earlier introduction, is to give anybody working in heritage and culture the information and links to the information that they need to put heritage and culture into their decision-making mix, whatever their decision is.
Yeah. Well, you, as you just hinted at a little earlier, have to head off to take part in one of your voluntary roles, do you not? I'm going to let you go, and you enjoy that sandwich.
Thank you. I shall report back on what particular variety of sandwich and whether they were dried up around the edges. Perfect. I'm sure they won't be. But the Royal Borough of Greenwich, I'm sure, will do a wonderful job sorting playing host to everybody. It's actually being held at another Grade 2 listed building, which is part of the network of community centres, of which the one that I'm on the board for is involved with as well. So it's one of those occasions when it's a chance to network. It's a chance to get talk to councillors who make the decisions, and so on. So it's where this low level kind of activism really matters. That room will be full of people who are trying to assure the future of their organisations, to try and say, well, give us the funding or whatever. It's an important part of the local democratic process, being responsible.
And you've got to go and get there. You've got 13 minutes by my count to be ready.
That's right. Yeah, no, I think it's important. But look, before I go, one other last thing. Perhaps we should clip this and put it at the top of the watching brief as well. But it's all about resources. It's all about being able to having the ability to do stuff. And if you enjoy what we do, if you like the stuff that we do, even if you're enraged by watching brief, but if there would be something about it that you'd miss if we weren't here, please like the channel, subscribe, and if you can visit Patreon or Ko-fi and maybe bunk us a few quid every now and then, that would be hugely appreciated. Yeah. As I say, in the context of 13 years, 14 years of living with those sorts of expectations, it would be helpful. Grand guys, until next time, do take care, and you go and be, a good civic member of society. I'm to go and network. Yeah. Bye.
What do?
No big fire, traitor.